Good evening. Whoa. Good evening. How's everybody doing? Great to be learning with you on a Tuesday, Yom Shlishi. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house? Yehuda in South Carolina, Nancy in North Carolina, Bill in Mid-Missouri, Paula in the Great Northwest, Guy in Ohio, Melissa in Great Neck. Hi, I'm in Florida, Aoife in Florida, Alan in New York City, Moishi in Brooklyn. Lester in Spring Valley. That's my old neck of the woods. I grew up in New City. Marie in Freeport, New York. Ella in Southern California, Elon in Silver Spring, and Elise in Hampton, Virginia. Welcome, everybody. Today's episode of AT Daily is sponsored by our own Sue Strauss in the house out of Chicago, Illinois, in memory of two friends who passed this year, Sue Sherman Martinez and Rose Mayer, along with my parents, Ruth and Herman Strauss, and my brother, Arthur T. Strauss. May all the souls, may all the neshamas have an aliyah, a great elevation in the world of souls, and go even a little higher thanks to our learning today in their merit. And Sue, thank you so much for enabling us to share more Torah with more people around the world. In the merit of that, may you and all your loved ones be showered in blessings. We say amen. And please, folks, it's that time of year. If you're thinking about some gift giving, some charitable giving between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, donate.accidentaltalmudist.org would be a great place to do it. And you can donate an episode of AT Daily like Sue just did. Okay, our daf today is page 14 here in Tractate Zevachim, the 29th volume of the Talmud, continuing our discussion of Mishnah number 3 here in chapter 1. We've been talking about beyond the slaughter of an animal offering, what about collecting the blood, conveying the blood, and sprinkling the blood on the altar? That's an external offering. An internal offering, like the goats of Yom Kippur, or the bull of the high priest on Yom Kippur, has its sprinkling done inside the sanctuary, on the curtain, or even within the Holy of Holies. But those are the only internal offerings. What if during these other procedures of bringing an offering, a priest who was doing it had a mistake of intent, wrong intent, for the wrong owner, for the wrong type of offering, while he was doing one of these other elements of the ritual? Is it disqualified, meaning it no longer fulfills the obligation of the owner of that offering who was bringing it? And in some cases, the sin offering and the Pesach, it could be rendered unfit as well, meaning the offering stops dead, does not complete its journey to the altar, or you cannot even be brought as a gift offering like other offerings that deviate from the correct type of offering or owner. They no longer propitiate God, as it's called, right? That they would fulfill the obligation. Once there's mistaken intent, it doesn't fulfill the obligation of the owner, but all the other offerings beside the sin offering and the Pesach at least complete their journey, and the owner gets credit for bringing a gift offering. For a sin offering and a Pesach, no, the offering just stops. It cannot be completed. No further action can be taken once one of these mistakes is made. Okay. We are about about a third of the way down on page 14a. The Mishnah, our Mishnah number 3, taught that Rabbi Shimon deems the offering fit if the prohibited intent was during the rite, R-I-T-E, of conveying the blood to the altar, because he held that while collecting the blood and sprinkling the blood are essential steps in bringing an offering, conveying is not indispensable, because you do have the option of slaughtering the animal right next to the altar. You still have to collect the blood from the slaughter, but then you could sprinkle it right there. There wouldn't need to be conveying. Therefore, since it's not indispensable, if you had the incorrect intent during that part of the procedure, it would not disqualify the offering. But Rabbi Shimon is in the minority on that. The majority overruled him. Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish says, also known as Reish Lakish, Rabbi Shimon concedes that prohibited intent during the conveying of the blood of the inner sin offerings would disqualify them, since with regard to those offerings, it is an indispensable rite, because the blood must be sprinkled inside the sanctuary, and the offering cannot be slaughtered inside the sanctuary for those inner sin offerings, those inner offerings, the ones of Yom Kippur. For those offerings, conveyance is an indispensable part of the procedure, and if a priest had wrong intent during those steps, it would disqualify the offering, even according to Rabbi Shimon. The Gemara asks, but doesn't Rabbi Shimon say that with regard to any offering whose blood is not sprinkled on the external altar like a peace offering, one is not liable to be punished with kares for eating it due to the prohibition of pigul? In other words, the law of pigul, having an intent for that the part of the offering that will be consumed at the time of slaughter, the priest has in mind that it'll be consumed beyond the deadline, and that renders the offering disqualified immediately. That's pigul. That's an explicit verse in the Torah. So Rabbi Shimon is saying, in other words, the law of pigul does not apply to inner sin offerings at all. Now, whether the law of pigul apply to inner sin offerings get brought now as either support or objection to Rabbi Shimon's view that conveyance is not an indispensable right unless it involves an inner offering. Why are we now switching to pigul? Let's keep reading. Rabbi Yosei, the son of Rabbi Hanina, says Rabbi Shimon concedes that although intent to consume an inner sin offering after its designated time does not render it pigul, it disqualifies the offering due to a kal v'chomer inference, just as sacrifice for its sake, which is valid in the case of a peace offering, a shalomim, is nevertheless not valid in the case of a sin offering, as stated in our Mishnah on 2a, right? It would still be fit if it had the wrong intent for any other offering except a sin offering and a Pesach. So too, isn't it logical that sacrifice with intent to consume it beyond its designated time, pigul, which does disqualify peace offerings, should also disqualify sin offerings? And the Gemara asks, well, and we found a source for the law that intent to consume an inner sin offering beyond its designated time does disqualify it, even according to Rabbi Shimon. From where do we derive that intent to consume it outside its designated area also disqualifies it? And here, the word consume is being used a little bit creatively by the sages, because normally we think about eating, right? So either a peace offering or a sin offering. Peace offering is eaten by its owner. Sin offering, parts of the animal are eaten by the priests. But that's in terms of human eating. The altar itself also consumes, right? The parts of the sacrificial, the sacrificial portions that are burned on the altar, that's also considered consumption. And even sprinkling the blood, right, is considered consumption in this regard. And so if you do that in the wrong place, that should also disqualify the offering. Although, as we've seen, there's a question, well, if it happens after the sprinkling of the blood, which is the actual atonement moment, then the fact that something was, placed in the wrong part of the altar afterwards or consumed in the wrong area afterwards might not disqualify. All right, let's see what's being said here. Let's say, Rabbi Yosef, the son of Rabbi Hanina, says, Rabbi Shimon concedes that although intent to consume an inner sin offering after its designated time does not render it pigul, wait, we just read that. Outside the designated area. So from where do we derive that intent to consume it outside its designated area also disqualifies it? If we derive it from the case of intent to consume it beyond its designated time, one may respond, well, what is notable about pigul, intent to consume it beyond its designated time? It is notable in that it can render an offering pigul, for partaking of which one is liable to receive kares. Something that's been rendered pigul, if you then eat it intentionally, you're liable to kares, death at the hands of the heavenly court, also known as excision. If we derive it from the case of intent not for its sake, one may respond, well, what is notable about sacrifice not for its sake? It is notable that this disqualification applies even to sacrifice on a private altar during the era when such altars were permitted, very brief periods in Jewish history. By contrast, intent to consume the offering outside its designated area is irrelevant to sacrifice on a private altar, which has no designated area, right? There were just these short times in Jewish history when people could build their own altars. Like between coming out of Egypt and before the Torah was given, short time when the children of Israel first entered Israel. But for the most part, especially after the Torah was given, God said, you only bring your offerings in the place that I shall choose, right? Meaning the main altar at the tabernacle for the first 400 years after the giving of the Torah. And then when Solomon built the first temple, it would be there. And then the second temple a little bit later. And you can't sacrifice on private altars. But we do study the law of those few brief years when it was permitted to have a private altar. Nonetheless, private altars didn't have methodically laid out areas of what we do and what we don't do. People were, doing their own thing. So these kinds of laws would not apply there. Now the Gemara answers, with regard to what offering does, and please note that now in the post-Second Temple period, we don't bring sacrifices at all and haven't in 2,000 years. And there is no law of private altars since the Second Temple was destroyed, in case somebody was wondering about that. We don't do that. Now, the Gemara answers, with regard to what offering does disqualification due to intent not for its sake apply? It applies to the Pesach and the sin offering. See, I think the corn has been a little bit sloppy because earlier we said disqualify means, does not fulfill the person's obligation, and fit or unfit means cannot complete its journey, which only applies to the sin offering and the Pesach. Here they're using the word disqualified the way we've been using unfit. Okay. It applies to the Pesach and the sin offering. Since a Pesach and a sin offering may not be sacrificed on a private altar, this factor would be irrelevant. So one may therefore derive from the case of intent not for its sake that intent to consume the offering outside its designated area disqualifies it, right? That intent to consume, whatever that means, whether it's actual eating or consumption by the altar is what they really mean here. And that if you were having bad intent during the sprinkling or the slaughter, etc., it would be like having the wrong kind of intent with respect to the type of offering or the owner, if you intended to consume outside its designated area. And if you wish, say that it is derived from the juxtaposition of the law of intent to consume the offering beyond its designated time, pigul, and the law of intent to consume it outside the designated area. And the verse states, and if any of the flesh of the sacrifice of his peace offerings is at all eaten on the third day, it shall not be accepted, neither shall be imputed to the one who offers it. It shall be an abhorred thing, pigul. And this statement, on the third day, it shall not be accepted, is referring to intent to consume the offering beyond its designated time. And this seemingly superfluous statement, neither shall it be imputed to the one who offers it, it shall be pigul, is referring to intent to consume it outside its designated area, right? So you have to have correct intent with respect to time and correct intent with respect to space, or place, as it were. So such juxtaposition indicates that there are parallel laws in the two cases, even if they are dissimilar. Okay, new topic. Rava says, if you say that Rabbi Shimon holds in accordance with the opinion of his son, Rabbi Elazar, who says that the area between the entrance hall and the altar is considered part of the north of the temple courtyard, then the only place where a sin offering may be slaughtered, which is the only place, the Torah says that sin offerings have to be slaughtered in the north part of the courtyard. So the question is, well, what exactly does that include once we get specific? And I'll bring the model over in 1 second. So therefore, he must also hold that prohibited intent while conveying the blood of the inner sin offerings is effective to disqualify them only from the doorway of the entrance hall inward. Prohibited intent before the priest reaches the doorway of the entrance hall does not disqualify the offering, as conveying the blood to the doorway is not necessary. The offering could have been slaughtered at the doorway in the first place. Again, having incorrect intent during these other parts of the service, like conveying, will only disqualify the offering if that part of the service is indispensable, right? And according to Rabbi Shimon, conveying is not indispensable because you could slaughter the animal right next to the external altar, the large altar. So now, with respect to inner offerings where the blood needs to be sprinkled inside, okay, now even he would agree that conveying will, if you have the wrong intent during conveyance, render the offering unfit in the case of a sin offering. But what they're saying now is, okay, well, when does that indispensable conveying actually begin? Right? Only when you actually enter, when a priest enters the sanctuary, because he could have slaughtered the animal right at the door, at the entrance hall of the sanctuary. Okay. So what are we talking about here? Here's our model of the Holy Temple, looking at it from above. Okay, this is called the women's courtyard here. In other words, this is a place where regular Jews could go. Up here is the actual courtyard where only priests could go. This is the north part of, maybe I need a different kind of pointer. Let's try this. Okay. Right, so this is the courtyard where only priests could go. This here is the altar. Okay, this is the north, right? Because the way this is laid out, right, this is west, this is east, west, east, north, south. Okay. So again, it's hard for me to see, but this is the northern part of the courtyard. And where they're talking about the entrance hall, they mean this area right here, between the altar and the actual entrance to the sanctuary here, right? And so inner offerings, the priest would have to walk up those steps and into the sanctuary. And inside the sanctuary is where you have the table with the showbreads and the actual menorah. And then when you go to the back of this area, we can't see inside, but this is actually kind of divided into two parts. This part, just if we would be down here on the floor level, but this part is the sanctuary and this part is the Holy of Holies, and there's a curtain in between them where these inner offerings would be brought to. So the point that he's making right now is that, okay, for inner offerings where they have to be brought inside the sanctuary, conveyance, indispensable conveyance, would only begin once he enters the sanctuary, because he could slaughter the animal if it's considered part of the northern courtyard, right in that area, the entrance hall between the altar and the sanctuary. Okay. Again, as so often happens when we're talking about the type of law where at times you're obligated, at times you're not obligated, at times you've broken the law, at times you haven't broken the law. The sages are going to be very interested in, okay, well, what is the clear line between what's permitted and what's prohibited, between, when you are in the clear and when you violated something. And they're always going to be most interested in those liminal areas, right, that are right at the edge. So this idea that if you have incorrect intent, it disqualifies the offering is only when you're doing something that is indispensable to the procedure. So even though conveying is indispensable to an inner sin offering, the indispensable part of conveying only begins at the door to the sanctuary. You could have slaughtered the animal right there. So conveying anywhere else in the courtyard until you reach that entrance hall would be considered, according to Rabbi Shimon, not indispensable. And so if you had incorrect intent during that part of your walk, it wouldn't disqualify the offering. But according to the majority, according to the rabbis, it would. Okay, so getting back here, let's just reread this paragraph. Rava says, if you say that Rabbi Shimon holds in accordance with the opinion of his son Rabbi Elazar, who says that the area between the entrance hall and the altar is considered part of the north of the temple courtyard, then the only place where a sin offering may be, and that is the only place where a sin offering may be slaughtered, then he must also hold that prohibited intent while conveying the blood of an inner sin offering is effective to disqualify the offering only from the door of the entrance hall and inward. Prohibited intent before the priest reaches the doorway of the entrance hall does not disqualify the offering, as conveying the blood to the doorway is not necessary. The offering could have been slaughtered at the doorway in the first place. And if you say that Rabbi Shimon holds in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, who says that the interior of the temple courtyard sanctifies offerings, i.e., that offerings can be sacrificed on the courtyard floor as if it were part of the altar, prohibited intent while conveying the removed bowls of frankincense from the table in the sanctuary to burn them on the external altar is effective to disqualify them only while conveying them from the doorway of the sanctuary outward of the entrance hall. Since the table could be placed anywhere in the sanctuary, conveying the bowls of frankincense after they've been burning there, I think for a week, in the sanctuary itself is unnecessary, since the table could have been located right by the door, and once the priest exits the entrance hall to the temple courtyard, the frankincense could theoretically be burned immediately. Again, very hypothetical, testing like what exactly does the law hold. This wouldn't really happen. Rava continues, and if you say that Rabbi Shimon holds that the sanctity of the sanctuary and the entrance hall are one and the same, and the table can be placed in the entrance hall as well, then prohibited intent is effective only while conveying the frankincense from the doorway of the entrance hall outward, i.e., in the doorway of the entrance hall itself. And if you say that he also holds that inside the doorway is considered like inside the entrance hall, then the table could be placed in the doorway too, and prohibited intent is not effective while conveying the frankincense even one step, because you could basically just throw it from the doorway onto the altar and there wouldn't have been any conveyance at all. Therefore, since it's not indispensable, having incorrect intent wouldn't disqualify that part of the service. And if you say that he also holds that inside the doorway is considered like inside the entrance hall, then the table can be placed in the doorway too, and prohibited intent is not effective while conveying the frankincense even one step. Rather, it is effective only during the moment when the frankincense is taken out of the doorway to the courtyard, the time it takes the priest to stretch out his hand to place the bowls on the courtyard floor. And if you say that he also holds that conveying an offering not by foot is not considered conveying, then prohibited intent is not effective at all while conveying the bowls of frankincense. We're going to let that go. New topic. Abaye said to Rav Chisda's interpreter. Now this is interesting. What did we mean by interpreter? Does Rav Chisda not speak the same language as Abaye? Of course they speak the same language. Here we're translating interpreter as interpreter the word amora. Like that's singular, plural amoraim. We're very accustomed to the word amoraim. Amoraim are the sages of the Gemara, right? The sages of the Mishnaic period, which ended in the year 200 of the Common Era, are called Tanaim, singular Tana, and the sages of the Gemara are called Amoraim, singular Amora. So what are we talking about here? Rav Chisda's interpreter. So basically we're getting a little bit of an insight into how the sages delivered Torah lectures to large audiences in a time when there was no microphones and PA systems and amplification, but where they could draw a crowd. So what would they do? The sage would be, on the dais in front of the large crowd. And then right next to him would be a loudmouth like me. Somebody's just loud and can project. And so the sage usually would speak in Hebrew. And then his Amora, which now is being translated as interpreter, and the question is, why isn't it being called a repeater? Because really he's just supposed to be repeating, but he's not. He's going to translate from Hebrew into Aramaic, which was the lingua franca, right? The common language of these people. So he's already translating, and you know that anytime you translate teachings from one language to another, there's going to be some measure of interpretation. And not only that, but the Amora who would do that for a gadol, for a great sage, would often, add a few words of explanation, since he kind of knows the audience maybe a little bit better than the sage who might be visiting, and is teaching in Hebrew. So he might add just a few words of explanation as he's translating and projecting really loud. And of course, if the crowds were large enough, then you would have repeaters, kind of a ring of repeaters. The sage would speak in Hebrew, his Amora would translate to Aramaic and say it really loud. And if that wasn't loud enough to reach, people way back, then there'd be someone halfway, from the stage to the back of the room who would hear what the guy on stage was saying and then repeat it for the people at the back of the crowd. At any rate, that's what an Amora was. One who translates and just adds a little bit of explanation sometimes. So why were the sages of the Gemara known as Amoraim? Because that's what the name they humbly gave themselves. Right? Our job is to basically just repeat the teachings of the earlier sages who were closer to the revelation at Mount Sinai than we are. They are holier and their teachings are more pure than ours are. So we don't want to lose anything that they were giving over to us. We'll just add a few words of explanation. Of course, the few words of the Amoraim, the Gemara is a lot longer than the Talmud because there were so many of them arguing on so many different points. But in theory, they're just giving over, just repeating what the Tanaim said with just a slight few extra words of explication, not new rulings. It's just that there were always so many different questions that hadn't been answered yet that they had to issue novel rulings. But generally, they never disagree with the Tanaim. They're just their job is to explicate what the Tanaim had said. Okay, so Abaye said to Rav Chisda's Amora, ask Rav Chisda for me, what is the law with regard to a non-priest conveying the blood? Right? So a non-priest can slaughter the animal. Slaughtering doesn't have to be done by a priest, but a priest definitely has to collect the blood and in a service vessel, and a priest has to sprinkle the blood. Does a priest have to convey the blood? Sounds like, doesn't that depend on whether conveyance is an indispensable part of the process or not? You would think that according to the majority, a priest has to convey the blood, and because it's in between the two indispensable steps of collecting the blood and sprinkling it, and perhaps according to Rabbi Shimon, a non-priest can convey the blood. It doesn't have to be a priest, but let's see. That would be my guess. So Abaye said, ask Rav Chisda, can a non-priest convey the blood? Is the offering disqualified, as in a case where a non-priest performs any other sacrificial rite that may be performed only by priests? And Rav Chisda said to him, the offering remains fit. And a verse supports my ruling. And they slaughtered the Pesach, and the priests sprinkled the blood, which they received of their hand, and the Levites flayed them, right? Flayed the animals, skinned them, so that they could then be roasted and eaten. So apparently priests are required only for the sprinkling of the blood on the altar and later rites. Just as the slaughter may be performed by non-priests, perhaps so too the collection and conveying of the blood could be performed by non-priests. Rav Sheshes objects, and he brings a baraisa. If a non-priest or an acute mourner. Who is an acute mourner? If your parent, God forbid, dies, or your brother, sister, spouse, son, or daughter dies, so very close relative, then on the day of the death, you are an acute mourner, and you don't have to do anything, right? All the positive mitzvahs don't apply to you because you're an acute mourner. The next day, when the body is buried, then you transition from being an acute mourner to a mourner, right? You're still going to have Shiva, and there's some things that don't apply to you, but generally most of the positive mitzvahs do apply to you. Now, in the case of priests serving in the temple, a priest who is an acute mourner is excused from the temple service. A high priest who is an acute mourner is not. He has to do his job even if this close relative died on that day. That's the duties of a high priest. Okay, so what's relevant here? Rav Sheshes raises an objection from a baraisa which says, if a non-priest or an acute mourner or a drunk priest or a blemished priest, right? These are all people who are excused from their jobs in the temple service, or not even just excused, but disqualified. A priest cannot serve while he's drunk or blemished. Apparently, nor as an acute mourner, nor if he's a non-priest. So the rites, so if he performs the rites of collection, conveying, or sprinkling the blood, the offering is disqualified. So a non-priest cannot collect the blood, nor convey it. That's a pretty strong source in order to contradict Rav Chisda's ruling. And likewise, it is, and now we're on page 14b, and likewise it is disqualified if a priest performs any of these rites while sitting. Priests had to be standing. And not only that, barefoot. Priests served barefoot. And it gets quite cold in Jerusalem in the winter, but they had to have their feet in direct contact with the floor of the Holy Temple. And this is likewise the law if a priest performs any of these rituals with his left hand. Sounds like even if he was a lefty, he has to use his right hand for these matters. And the Gemara concludes, this is a conclusive refutation of Rav Chisda's ruling. If a non-priest conveys the blood, it is disqualified. So the Gemara asks, but didn't Rav Chisda state a verse as proof that the offering is not disqualified? The verse states that the priest sprinkled the blood after receiving it from Levites, non-priests. Or maybe the Levites were doing the flaying, but they just received it in their hand from someone else. Who's someone else? Non-priests. So the Gemara answers, the verse described the case where the non-priests served as a bench, and it's taba. The priest would give the blood to the non-priest to hold it for them and would then take it and sprinkle the blood. The non-priest would not convey the blood to the altar. They were just acting as a stool, basically, holding on to it for a moment while the priests were, doing whatever they had to do. So Rabba and Rabbi Yosef both say that the case of a non-priest conveying the blood is subject to a dispute between Rabbi Shimon and the rabbis. According to Rabbi Shimon, who says that a dispensable rite is not classified as a true rite and therefore does not disqualify the offering performed with prohibited intent, the offering is fit even if the conveying of the blood is performed by a non-priest. And according to the rabbis who hold that a dispensable rite is classified as a true rite, the conveying of the blood is not valid if performed by a non-priest, right? Just what we would have expected. Abaye said to him, but what about slaughter? Which is certainly an indispensable rite, and yet the offering is fit even if it is performed by a non-priest. And we know that a non-priest can slaughter. It's from then on everything has to be done by a priest. So why is it that a non-priest may perform the slaughter? And he said to Abaye, slaughter, although it is indispensable, right? You have to shech the animal so that it can enter the sacrificial process, blood collected, etc. it is nevertheless not classified as a sacrificial rite at all. Therefore, it need not be performed by a priest. In other words, shechting or slaughter is indispensable, but it's indispensable so that the blood will pour out of the neck of the animal so that a priest can collect it in a service vessel. That's why it's indispensable, but it is not an indispensable, but it is not a holy sacrificial rite in itself. And so the Gemara says, whoa. And is it not a sacrificial rite in itself? But doesn't Rabbi Zera say that Rav says if the slaughter of a red heifer is performed by a non-priest, it is not valid? Now, is a red heifer a sacrificial offering? Trick question, right? Very important. We only had 9 red heifers in history. Why are they so important? Because a red heifer needs to be slaughtered. Where is it slaughtered? Not on the Temple Mount. On Mount of Olives, opposite the Temple Mount. Special ramp built for this purpose. They slaughter the red heifer. It is shechted properly. It has to be done by a priest. But a red heifer is not slaughtered. They build a pyre over there, a fire. They burn all the parts of the red heifer on that fire. They collect the ashes, and it's those ashes that are later mixed with waters of sprinkling that purify people who came into contact with a corpse, right, with a dead body, so that they would be able to enter the Temple Mount and bring offerings. That's what the red heifer was needed for. It is not a sacrifice. It is necessary so that priests and other people can enter the temple if they become impure through contact with a corpse. So it's necessary for the processes of the temple, but it's not a sacrifice in itself. So there's a distinction. We can't say that just because only a priest can shecht a red heifer, therefore only a priest can shecht sacrificial offerings, because these are different categories of animals being shechted for a job, for a function of the Holy Temple. It's different categories. Okay. And is it not? But doesn't Rabbi Zera say that Rav says if the slaughter of the red heifer was performed by a non-priest, it is not valid? And Rav said about this law, it is derived from the phrases Elazar the priest in Numbers 19:3 and statute in Numbers 19:2, which are written with regard to the red heifer. So the mention of Elazar indicates that the slaughter must be performed by a priest, and the term statute indicates that one may not deviate from any of the details of the service as delineated in the verses. If one does, the heifer is disqualified. So that's how we know that the red heifer has to be slaughtered by a priest, one of the descendants of Aaron. And the Gemara answers, the red heifer is different, as it is not an offering. It has the sanctity of items consecrated for temple maintenance. The laws that govern its service, therefore, differ from those of offerings proper. The Gemara asks, but does this not prove the point all the more? If slaughtering an animal consecrated for temple maintenance is tantamount to a sacrificial rite, can slaughtering offerings which are sacrificed on the altar not be considered a sacrificial rite? And Rav Shesha, the son of Rav Idi, said the slaughter of the red heifer is considered just as it is in the case of shades of marks of tsuras, which are deemed ritually pure or impure by a priest. Although this is not a sacrificial rite, it requires a member of the priesthood to perform it. The fact that a priest is required in order to do something doesn't make it a sacrificial rite. A sacrificial rite is one that is involved in bringing offerings. Slaughtering the red heifer has to be done by a priest, but it's not an offering. Therefore, the requirement that the red heifer be slaughtered by a priest does not prove that it is classified as a sacrificial rite. And the Gemara further challenges the premise of Rabbah and Rav Yosef that a dispensable rite can be performed by a non-priest. But what about conveying the limbs of the offering to the ramp, which is a dispensable rite, as the offering could have been slaughtered right next to the ramp? And nevertheless, if it is performed by a non-priest, the offering is disqualified, as it is written, and the priest shall sacrifice the whole of it, all of it, and make it smoke upon the altar, Leviticus 1:13. And the master says this is referring to conveying the limbs to the ram, right? For instance, when you bring an elevation offering, they slaughter it, collect its blood, convey that blood to the altar, sprinkle it there. Now that animal is going to, go up in smoke. It's an elevation offering. It's going to be entirely consumed by the altar. Do they just carry the whole animal and dump it on the fire that's on the altar? No, they do not. They cut up the animal. And then there's a procession of priests who carry the various parts of the animal and place it on the altar fire. And that procession of priests who are carrying the various limbs of the animal, that has to be done by priests. So the Gemara answers, in a case where the verse explicitly revealed that a rite must be performed by a priest, it revealed it. But in a case where the Torah did not reveal it, it did not reveal it. So with regard to conveying the blood, the Torah never specified explicitly that a priest is required, as in the case of carrying the limbs up to the altar. So why would a non-priest conveying blood to the altar disqualify the offering, according to this challenge? And the Gemara says, but is it not all the more so obvious, just as conveying the limbs to the ramp requires the conveyor to be a member of the priesthood, even though it does not prevent atonement if not performed at all, since atonement was already affected by the sprinkling of the blood? Kal v'chomer, all the more so is it not clear that concerning conveying the blood and sprinkling it on the altar, where the failure to convey it and sprinkle it on the altar prevents atonement, it must be that the conveyor be a member of the priesthood. This difficulty remains unresolved. And it was also stated that Ula says, that Rabbi Elazar says, in a case where conveying the blood is performed by a non-priest, the offering is disqualified, even according to Rabbi Shimon. Bottom line, if a non-priest conveys the blood, it does disqualify it. And maybe the proof was not satisfactory. That's why it's considered unresolved, but that's the law. Okay, new topic. A dilemma was raised before the sages. Is conveying the blood not by foot, but rather by passing it by hand to another priest considered conveying, or is it not considered conveying? Can the rite be performed in this manner? Is conveying the blood not by foot, but rather by passing it by hand to another priest? Interesting, like if they had a bucket brigade. So nobody walked with it, but they just passed it from one priest to the next. It was all done by priests, but nobody walked with it. Is that technically considered conveying or not? The Gemara suggests, come in here evidence from the Baraisa. And likewise, if the priest collected, conveyed, or sprinkled the blood while sitting, and likewise, if he performed any of these rites with his left hand, the offering is disqualified. Since only sitting is listed, one consequently infers that the priest conveyed the blood while standing, but in a manner similar to sitting. What is that? Outstretching his hand without walking. In that case, the offering is fit. So evidently, conveying the blood does not require walking. But the Gemara rejects this inference. Perhaps when the Baraisa states sitting, it is referring to one who conveys the blood by moving toward the altar while sitting on the ground in such a manner that he rubs himself against the floor of the courtyard as he pulls himself forward. He's sitting, but he's kind of, shuffling along on his butt. So he's getting there, but he's doing it in a position of sitting. Perhaps that's what's prohibited and not anything else. Let's see. Perhaps when the Baraisa states sitting, it means this kind of shuffling. If so, the parallel case of standing in a manner similar to sitting is a case where the priest moves forward a bit. He's not walking, but he's kind of inching along. So perhaps if he does not move at all and merely outstretches his hand, the rite is not valid. It requires that he move himself a little bit. So the Gemara suggests, come in here, a proof from a Mishnah, Tractate Pesachim 64a. An Israelite would slaughter the Pesach and a priest would collect the blood. The priest would be lined up from the place where the lamb was slaughtered until the altar. The priest collected the blood, would immediately hand it to another priest standing next to him, and the other priest would pass it to another, and so forth until it would reach the altar. So evidently the blood can be passed from hand to hand. It need not be conveyed by foot. Why were the priests doing that on Pesach? Because they had thousands of lambs to slaughter. They very much had to have a really fast system, a kind of bucket brigade, passing along these service vessels containing the collected blood from all the Pesachim, right? The Pesach offerings that so many people were bringing on the afternoon before Pesach was that night when the temple stood in Jerusalem. So there too, the Gemara answers, the priests would move a bit with their feet while passing the blood forward, so that you could say they were walking even though they were passing it. And the Gemara asks, but what is the Mishnah teaching us in this description if not that the blood need not be conveyed by foot? And the Gemara answers, it teaches that in the multitude of people is the king's glory. It honors God when the temple service is performed by a multitude of priests. The Gemara suggests, coming here, another resolution from a Mishnah on page 32a of this tractate. If a priest who was fit for temple service collected the blood in a vessel and gave it to an unfit individual standing next to the altar, that individual should return it to the fit priest so that he may perform a complete act of conveying the blood to the altar. So evidently the blood must be conveyed to the altar by foot. If conveying by hand were valid, another priest could simply take the blood from the unfit person and complete the conveying of the blood to the altar. And the Gemara rejects this inference. No, say that the wording of the Mishnah should be amended. Instead of stating that the unfit person should return the vessel to the fit priest, it should state that the fit priest, even another priest, should then receive it from the unfit person. If so, the Mishnah proves nothing about conveying by hand and whether the priest actually has to be moving or not, or if he can just pass it from one priest to another. It was stated, Ula says that Rabbi Yochanan says conveying the blood not by foot is not considered conveying. And the Gemara asks, well, if the blood was conveyed by hand, is it possible to correct it by conveying it again properly? Or is it not possible to correct it and the offering is already disqualified permanently? If you passed it by hand to an unfit priest, he could just hand it back. Maybe that moment it was passed to an unfit priest, the whole thing is disqualified. And the Gemara suggests, now we're on page 15a, if you have questions or comments, please get them in now. The Gemara suggests, come in here, proof from the aforementioned Mishnah. If a priest fit for temple service collected the blood in a vessel and he gave the vessel to an unfit person standing next to him, standing next to the altar, then that latter person should return it to the fit priest. So apparently, even after the blood is conveyed in an inappropriate manner, it can be corrected. The fact that an unfit priest touched it doesn't render it disqualified as long as he hands it back to a fit priest who then conveys it to the altar and sprinkles. And though one can indeed explain that the fit priest should then receive it from him as posited above, if it enters your mind that if the blood is conveyed incorrectly, it is not possible to correct it, well, the offering was already disqualified when the priest gave the blood to the unfit person. Taking it back is of no consequence if it was rendered unfit at that moment. But the Gemara rejects this inference. Do you maintain that this is referring to a case where the non-priest is standing inside, i.e. between the fit priest and the altar? No, it is a case where the non-priest is standing outside, further away from the altar than the priest. Therefore, when the priest gave him the blood, he was not conveying it toward the altar at all. He was moving it farther away from the altar. He was just acting like a table, right? Just resting it there for a moment. And it was stated that Ula says that Rabbi Yochanan says conveying the blood not by foot renders the offering unfit. So apparently it is not possible to correct it, as otherwise Rabbi Yochanan would have merely stated that it is not considered conveying, as in his earlier statement. Rav Nachman raised an objection to Ula from the Mishnah 32a. If the blood spilled from the vessel onto the floor and one collected it from the floor, it is still a fit sacrifice. So apparently, although spilling the blood on the floor constitutes a not valid conveyance toward the altar, it still can be corrected after the fact. And the Gemara explains, here we are dealing with a case where the blood that spilled went outward, i.e. away from the altar. So it did not constitute, a prohibited conveyance toward the altar. And the Gemara asks, can spilled blood go outward and not come inward? Clearly, spilled blood goes in all directions. So the Gemara answers, it is a case where the blood spilled on an inclined plane, and it therefore spilled only outward, away from the altar. And if you wish, say instead that it spilled into a hole in the ground, so it did not spread in any direction. And if you wish, say instead that it is a case where the blood is thick, so it did not spread out in all directions. And the Gemara asks, but did the Tana go to all that trouble just to teach us all these totally unlikely cases? And furthermore, rather than teaching in another chapter on page 25a that if the blood spilled from the animal's neck onto the floor and one collected it in a vessel from the floor, it is now unfit, let the Mishnah teach a distinction within the case where the blood spilled from the vessel itself. In what case is this statement that the blood is fit said? In a case where the spilled blood went outward away from the altar, but if it came inward, it is unfit. And the Gemara concludes, this is a conclusive refutation. If the blood is conveyed in a not valid manner, it can be corrected. Okay, seems like I'm getting no comments or questions on today's class. So let me just note that tomorrow's class, special time, Yom Kippur begins tomorrow night. Normally we would do it at noon Pacific on the day right before a holiday begins. But I can't do it at 12 tomorrow, so it's going to be at 12:30. Right? Special time tomorrow, 12:30 p.m. Pacific. Half an hour later than the pre-holiday time. Then we'll have no class on Thursday, Yom Kippur, and we'll resume at Friday at the regular Friday time, noon Pacific, and we will post that on the Facebook page. That's what I've got. All the best, my holy sisters and brothers.